Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Madam President. Most of my colleagues might, I assume, look at these pictures and think they depict facilities owned by ExxonMobil. Sorry, Madam President. Most of my colleagues would look at these pictures and think they depict facilities owned by ExxonMobil or BP. But this is, amazingly enough, a picture of Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley, to most Americans and most people in this chamber, if they know of it, is a bank. It used to be an investment bank. Now it's just considered a bank. Let me explain. Morgan Stanley owns a company called Transmontane, a petroleum and chemical transportation and storage company, and Heidmar Inc., which reportedly manages more than 100 oil tankers that look like this. Today, I held a banking subcommittee hearing that the presiding officer attended, as did Senator Merkley and Senator Toomey, to examine how the line between banks and commercial enterprises is blurring. Interestingly, these large institutions combine banks and trading firms and energy suppliers and oil refiners and warehouses and shipping companies and oil tankers and mining companies. Federally insured bank holding companies, once in the business of providing checking and savings accounts to workers or loans to small businesses, are now also in the business of owning physical commodities, aluminum, oil, electricity. Witnesses testified at the subcommittee hearing that these risky Wall Street practices are actually inflating prices for manufacturers and consumers. Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs take their cut when you fill up your tank, take their cut when you buy a Coke or buy a beer in an aluminum can, take their cut increasingly in the copper market, a metal that is in all kinds of industrial products. A recent article in the New York Times said, and I'll quote, the maneuvering in markets for oil and wheat and cotton and coffee and more, it brought billions in profits to investment banks like Goldman and JP Morgan Chase and Morgan Stanley, while forcing customers to pay more every time they fill up a gas tank, flick on a light switch, open a beer, or buy a cell phone. For years, our nation separated banking from traditional commerce. But about 13, 14 years ago, after years of eroding that protection, Congress finally tore down what was left of that wall. Beyond just combining commercial banking with insurance and investment banking, banks are now allowed to trade in commodities and to engage in a variety of non-financial activities. 4 years later, after that 1999 repeal, the Federal Reserve enabled the first financial holding company to trade in physical commodities. The justification for this is a familiar one. Other companies were doing it, they told us. Banks were at a competitive disadvantage. Over the next 6 years, the rules unraveled, becoming looser and looser until the loopholes were big enough for these six megabanks, now $600 billion in assets, up to $2.3 billion in assets. The loopholes were big enough for these six megabanks to jump through. The expansion of our financial system into traditional areas of commerce, from crude oil to natural gas to mining and shipping, hasn't happened in a vacuum. It's been accompanied by a host of anti-competitive activities. These activities threaten consumers. They have threatened American businesses that rely upon efficient markets and arm's-length transactions. They especially threaten American manufacturing when they buy and sell and manage and transport and store metals. From speculation to the oil and gas markets to inflated prices for energy to energy manipulation, we know the role of banks has expanded. Banks have expanded far beyond their traditional roles. There's been little public awareness of or debate about the massive expansion of our largest financial institutions into new areas of the economy. That's in part because regulators have been less than transparent about basic facts. We can't get from the Federal Reserve the information. Whether you're a citizen, whether you're a reporter, whether you're a senator sitting on the banking committee, you can't get from the Federal Reserve the information we need to know about the governance and these rules about commodity trading by the banks. It's also because these institutions are so complex and so dense and so opaque and so impossible for people to understand that they're impossible, that we simply can't figure out what we need to figure out. The six largest U.S. bank companies Holding companies have 14,000 subsidiaries. 6 largest U.S. banks, holding companies have 14,000 subsidiaries. Fewer than 20 of those 14,000 are traditional banks. There are 3 important issues here that concern me, that Morgan Stanley can own the refineries and can own the ships. There are 3 important issues that concern me, whether it's Morgan Stanley, whether it's Goldman Sachs, whether it's JP Morgan Chase, whether it's aluminum, whether it's copper, whether it's electricity, whether it's oil. 3 things. The lessons of this hearing were 3 things. First, these institutions can control physical goods and financial contracts based upon these goods, meaning they know more about the trading of these goods because they store the aluminum in 24 warehouses in Detroit, or because they're moving the oil in these tankers. They know more about transactions, know more about price, know more about movement of goods. So that means they can trade on inside information. It gives them an advantage in proprietary trading. It means they can manipulate markets. Second, these institutions, these banks that own the oil tanker and own the refineries, these banks have access to cheap funding, cheaper funding from the Federal Reserve. That means us as taxpayers, that they can use to finance their commodities activities. I'll say that again. It means because they can go to the window, they can get cheaper financing. These banks can get cheaper financing. They say there's a wall between their traditional bank activities and what they're doing owning these commodities and buying and selling and transporting and storing and gaming the markets. But they can get money cheaper from taxpayers. They can borrow money less expensive rate than anybody else, than their competitors who also might own oil tankers, who also might do refinery. Third, they're exposing themselves and us, the economy, to risks that could threaten our financial system. Just imagine the economic, the environmental, and the reputational impact to a mega bank of an Exxon Valdez or a BP oil spill. Think of the economic impact that could have on the stability of the bank and the success of the bank, and therefore the stability of the whole financial system. Today was the first of what I expect to be several hearings on this issue. Taxpayers have a right to know what is happening. American citizens have a say in our financial system because taxpayers are the ones who will be asked to rescue these mega banks yet again if the unthinkable, which almost inevitably happens in this world over time, if the unthinkable happens.